Hello, I'm Catherine Weatherburn, the founder of Safetyknot, and we work with construction companies and organisations who have construction elements in their projects with the aim to promote safety and to prevent injury. This video is intended as an entry point to highlight some key elements of duty of care that employers have, including minimum site welfare, considerations about who should be on site, and how to promote site safety through a daily site safety checklist. All construction workers have a right to work on sites where they do not get hurt or ill through work. The employer and the main contractor on site are responsible for health and safety, but individual workers must also help by being aware of their own and their employer's responsibilities. However, at Safetyknot, we do acknowledge the complexities of working in construction, especially in resource-limited contexts where we work. Based upon our experience and research, we realised that particularly for informal construction or community-led construction projects, there are a lack of appropriate safety policies, procedures, and protocols in place, or they simply don't exist. It can also be quite confusing about who is responsible for what when there are multiple organisations involved, with one saying that the other one's responsible for safety, and safety literally falling through the gaps. And actually, it falls upon the individual worker themselves to be responsible for safety. But this is about all aspects of safety they're responsible for. But in this situation, can this individual worker actually ensure their own safety? Are they in fact aware of their employer's responsibilities and duty of care to them? Also, are they aware of their own responsibilities? Have they received any or adequate safety training? Have they been provided any safety equipment? Ultimately, have workers been equipped with the knowledge, skills, and tools that they need to keep themselves safe on a work site? Now, only you can answer this about your construction workers that you work with. But another responsibility I want to touch upon is insurance. This may need to be provided for workers, and you'll know this by looking into relevant labour laws in your country to see if and what type of insurance needs to be provided and in place. In our experience, we've seen many cases of injury where insurance has not been provided to the worker, and this unfortunately has meant that the worker has had to pay for the treatment themselves. If the worker doesn't have any funds, they may need to borrow money. This could have high interest rate repayments, and this means that they may actually go into debt as a result of this injury. And this is especially if they're left with a lifelong disability resulting from injury, which means that they're unable to work as a construction worker again, or perhaps find any other work. Again, each context is different, and you'll need to look into the relevant labour laws to see if insurance is required, and if so, what type should be required. Now we're going to talk about site welfare. On construction sites, there is a requirement to provide a set of welfare standards. Now these include water, toilets, and shade. But I'm sure you'll have seen from your site visits, we definitely have working in more remote areas, that these requirements are not always met. But why? Well, let's look at them one by one. The provision of safe drinking water is required, and it's required because we need to keep workers hydrated. The work that workers do can be really strenuous, and if workers don't have access to drinking water, especially in hot climates or conditions, they can be really at risk of becoming dehydrations. Now, studies have actually shown that dehydration can lead to lapses in concentration. And these lapses in concentration, if they happen in an office environment, for example, these can lead to simple, harmless errors. But in a construction environment, these areas can be far, far more serious and maybe even fatal. But as I'm sure as you'll have seen from your site visits, some situations do make it harder for workers to stay hydrated. For example, if they're wearing a lot of personal protective equipment or PPE, if they're working outdoors or in hot conditions. So the Health and Safety Executive, the HSE in the UK, suggests that in such situations where a worker's ability to drink is actually restricted, that before they start any work, workers should be encouraged to drink 500 mils or a pint of water per hour before they start working. And this should also be the same during their rest periods, which is why breaks and rest periods are so vital. But you may be working with a community who has challenges with the provision of water itself. If the community doesn't have access to pipe-borne water, then it's challenging. And also, if they do have access to pipe-borne water, then it may not be safe to drink. So in these cases, there are several risks involved. There's the risk of dehydration to the worker, but there's also the risk of drinking unsafe water and becoming ill. Now, in our experience working in these contexts, communities have had to identify how to overcome these challenges so that they're able to provide safe drinking water. And in our experience, we've seen people have been nominated on site, that they're responsible for ensuring that safe drinking water is brought onto site every day. But of course, this will be achieved differently in every context. Ultimately, though, the aim here is to try to mitigate the risk of dehydration and also the risk of illness from drinking unsafe water. We want to keep workers hydrated by having access to safe drinking water. In addition to safe drinking water, shade should also be provided. This is particularly for people working in the sun and heat, as this can increase the risk of heart attacks, strokes, lung problems, and other diseases. To mitigate associated risks with working outside for prolonged periods of time, shade should be made available to enable workers to take breaks and to avoid associated risks of being exposed to the sun and heat. Now, this doesn't have to be an expensive, purpose-built structure. It can be a natural shade, such as a tree, or it could be a man-made shade, for example, by rigging up tarpaulin. Toilet facilities are also needing to be provided, just like the provision of safe drinking water. There may not be toilet facilities readily available. Now, in our experience, and from feedback from partner organisations, if there are no toilet facilities provided on site, then this can actually increase open defecation, which can then lead to the risk of associated illnesses. So to mitigate this risk, toilet facilities should be provided. One solution we have seen is that construction sites, if they're near communities, then sometimes an arrangement is made for workers to be able to use the community toilet facilities. Again, this will look different in every context, and you know your community best, but minimum welfare standards should also include access to toilet facilities. To further reduce the risk of illness, there should be a designated hand washing area with soap available on site. Having this facility can also help to reduce the severity of chemical burns if they're on the skin. It can also mean that workers can wash cement off if it gets onto the skin. And also if they get minor cuts from working on construction sites, they can wash these cuts to avoid infection. However, again, you may be thinking that the community you work with doesn't have access to clean running water, so how can they provide this? Well, in these cases, we've seen communities have put together buckets of water and bars of soap to be able to enable this facility on site. Also, in your experience, you'll know that minor cuts particularly happen on hands, arms and feet and legs in construction. These are very common occurrences. And that if workers can't wash these cuts, then they are at risk for injury. So putting this water in place should help with this as well and mitigate these minor injuries getting worse. However, if these injuries do arrive, they can often be treated on site with the use of a first aid kit. And a first aid kit is also part of minimum welfare facilities that should be provided. This should be stocked, all content should be in date, and it should be available to workers at all times. Now, this might sound quite straightforward, but in Safetyknot's experience, in our experience, this is actually quite a contentious issue. And the reason why is because a lot of construction sites actually have their first aid kits padlocked. And this is to avoid the risk of theft, or the first aid kit is kept at the manager's house. This means if it is needed, it's not available quickly. Another common issue we have seen is that the first aid kits are not replenished after use. So items are missing when they're needed. It may be that there's not a designated person in charge of this, or it may be that actually there's no additional budget to buy anything if it does get used. And this all contributes to this idea of safeguarding first aid from theft, but also from use. Now, of course, you know your community best and you'll know whether this is actually an issue for them. But the key take home here is that construction workers are at risk from minor injuries, which can be treated with a first aid kit. But to do so, a fully stocked first aid kit does need to be readily available to workers when they actually need it. Next, we're going to talk about who's on site, specifically children. So again, in our experience of visiting construction sites, there are children and even babies on site. Sometimes children are participating in labour, sometimes they're dropping off food, sometimes they're playing, and sometimes they actually live there. And obviously, in some countries, teenagers can participate in construction work, which is deemed to be low risk. But please refer to relevant labour laws to see exactly what is deemed appropriate and acceptable with regards to children in construction work. But at this point, I do just want to mention that Safetyknot doesn't condone any kind of child labour. And we strongly advocate that no children should be present on construction sites. And this is purely due to the high risk setting, even if they're not participating in labour. However, we do realise and acknowledge that it's not always as simple as this. Depending on the context, it may be common practice that children do participate in labour, even if there are laws in place to prevent child labour. Ultimately, though, whilst there may be many reasons why children are on site, children are at risk of death or injury because of the high risk nature of construction sites. This, though, is where you're best placed to navigate these very complex issues with your community. You'll be aware of the societal and the contextual practices and cultural practices that need to be discussed to navigate this. A partner organisation that we worked with found that children and babies were regularly being brought onto site by workers. This is because the primary caregivers were also construction workers. They were doing two roles, and they didn't want to leave their baby child unattended at home. So the organisation, to support these workers and so that they could continue to work but know that their children were safe, they provided free childcare for the duration of the project. However, workers continued to bring their children to the construction site. The employer didn't know why, but they assumed that the workers didn't understand the risk attached to children being brought to the construction site. So they wanted to have a discussion, and actually it transpired that this wasn't the case. Their assumption was incorrect. The parents understood the risk, but the reason childcare was not being used was because caregivers were from one Hindu caste and the children attending were from another Hindu caste. As a result, the parents didn't want the children to be looked after by the caregivers that were being provided. Now, here I'm not trying to give suggestions of how childcare should be arranged, but I merely want to point out that construction sites can be very high-risk locations which are not suitable for children, and they shouldn't be present. Yet in some contexts, we know that this is common practice, even though it is very likely to be against the law and also local labour law. Construction sites can appear really attractive to children, which is why they might try to come onto site to play. Therefore, it's best if workers can try to do everything they can to keep them out of the site and away from this danger. So this includes being mindful about securing sites when work's finished, covering or putting barriers up across excavations and pits, storing building materials carefully so that they can't roll or topple over, locking anything hazardous away, removing the access ladders from excavations and also from scaffolds, and also ensuring that children cannot access vehicles or plants, because these can all seem really exciting to children. Now, these actually are good practices to have anywhere in a construction site, but they're particularly relevant to child safety. Another organisation that we worked with decided to navigate some of these hazards and risks that were happening through implementing a safety site checklist. So what they did was to navigate these topics that we've discussed in this video, they implemented a daily site safety checklist. This checklist in itself doesn't eliminate any risks. I want to point out that the process, that having that checklist doesn't stop these risks, but the process of discussing with workers about what hazards are there, what risks do they feel that they are vulnerable to, means that workers are involved in this process and they can help to identify key risks to construction sites, and then they can also look at implementing mitigation measures to reduce the potential for harm from these identified hazards. So a site safety checklist is going to look different in every community. It's going to be really dependent upon the type of construction that's being conducted, the equipment that they're using, the context. And you'll of course know this best, but I would like to share with you a daily site safety checklist that a partner organisation, the PAL that we worked with, put together and implemented. They created a 5-point daily site safety checklist, which was to read out of the beginning of each of every day prior to work starting. Only when all 5 points had been achieved did work start. Their site safety checklist was: number 1, if you need personal protective equipment, PPE, for your construction work, you need to check it and then you need to wear it when appropriate. Number 2, we need to check that there's a first aid kit on site, that it's fully stocked and accessible. Number 3, do we have water? Make sure that we do, and remember to take regular breaks in shade and drink water to keep hydrated. Number 4, no children should be on site even if they're not working. And number 5, do not work if you have drunk alcohol or taken drugs. This particular community found that alcohol was a concern for them, as it was acceptable to drink alcohol prior to starting work because it was thought that this alcohol would give them energy to work. But it was also noticed that this was causing lapse in judgments, which was then resulting in injuries. And again, each community is going to be different, but that was specific to that community. In addition to safety checklists, toolbox talks can be really helpful. A toolbox talk is a short presentation on a single aspect of health and safety. So, for example, it could be that you're going to be using a cement mixer that day. So, the toolbox talk would be talking specifically about cement mixers. There's many toolbox talks available free of charge online, and the Health and Safety Executive in the UK have created many really good toolbox talks which you can use to save you the time and effort of having to make them yourself. But please do remember that these could be UK centric. And as always, if you're using any tools from online or you're transplanting any safety regulations from one context to another, you need to make sure that you adapt it so that it's culturally and contextually relevant and accessible. Because if you don't include these nuances, it's not going to be appropriate to the community that you work with. So I hope that you found this video helpful in highlighting some of the key elements of duty of care that employers have, which include minimum site welfare, considerations about who should be on site, and also how to promote site safety through a daily site safety checklist.